Well, today we're in 2 Corinthians 10, verses 1 through 8. I know the plan says to go through verse 9. Don't do it. If you do, you'll be driving yourself crazy trying to figure out how verse 9 is connected to verse 8, because our English translations make it sound like verse 9 is connected to verse 8. It's not. Don't go there. You'll drive yourself crazy. Verse 9 is connected to the next section. Verses 9, 10, and 11 go together as a package. So we'll talk more about that tomorrow, Lord willing. But for today, we're starting a brand new section, and really the final section of this letter. Chapters 10 through 13 comprise a section where Paul is now really going to be aggressive in not only defending the charges against him as an apostle, but specifically attacking these false apostles that have crept in and corrupted the minds of the Corinthians. Remember, chapters 1 through 7 is the first section. And in 1 through 7, Paul defends his ministry and explains why he did the things that he did, changed his travel plans, wrote them that sorrowful letter, made that sorrowful visit, all of that. And then chapters 8 and 9, he talked about the need to take up the collection. Well, here in this final section, he's really going on the offensive, and he's going to really tear down the arguments of these false apostles and try to keep them from perverting the minds of the Corinthians and leading them astray. Now, he hasn't up to this point really said much specifically about them, but he has left clues, especially in chapters 1 through 7. He's left clues about what these false apostles have been doing, but the way that he did it was sort of subtle, where he would talk about things that he as an apostle does not do. And the implication is that's what these false apostles are doing. So for instance, in chapter 1, Paul says, I do not operate according to fleshly wisdom. In chapter 2, he says, I do not peddle the gospel as some do. Chapter 3, he says, I'm not commending myself. Chapter 4, I'm not adulterating the word of God. Chapter 7, he says, I wronged no one, I corrupted no one, I took advantage of no one. Okay, and the implication is, these false apostles have done all those things. They have been living according to fleshly wisdom and peddling the gospel for money and commending and boasting in themselves and adulterating and corrupting the word and taking advantage of people. That's absolutely what they've been doing. And we know that because he tells us more specifically here in this final section that that is exactly what they are doing. And this is actually a rhetorical strategy, very common in the first century world, where you would have this sort of gradual approach to dealing with your opponents. You wouldn't just jump right in and start attacking them, but you would take this more subtle approach, and then at the end you'd really not pull your punches anymore. And this is what Paul is going to do in this section. And it's very fascinating because Paul's going to engage in boasting a lot in this section, but it sort of pains Paul because he doesn't like to boast. It's just he's going to do it because it's the only language the Corinthians seem to respond well to. They respond well to the boasting of these false apostles, building themselves up, talking about themselves. And so what Paul's going to do is say, okay, well, that's what I'm going to do for you then. I'm going to build myself up and talk about myself, because that seems to be what you respond the best to. And he calls it foolishness, really. So he'll talk about how he's going to engage in foolishness, and please, be patient while I engage in a little bit of foolishness here. But he's doing that because the Corinthians are acting like fools. And so in order to attract fools, he has to act foolishly. But of course, the difference between Paul's boasting and the boasting of these false apostles is that Paul will be boasting in the Lord. Paul will be boasting in his own weaknesses and the things that he suffers for the Lord. So it's a totally different kind of boasting, but Paul is being a little bit sarcastic in these chapters and ironic in these chapters, trying to attract the Corinthians by his boasting, because that's the language they speak, but it's a different kind of boasting from the false apostles. That's just sort of a big picture of these chapters. But let's get into today's section from 1 to 8. First of all, Paul mentions that he's continuing to be meek and gentle toward them in Christ. That he has strength, he has power, but he chooses not to use it. He's choosing not to enforce his apostolic power. I mean, think about some of the people, like in the book of Acts, that got on Paul's nerves and got on his bad side, like Elymas in Acts chapter 13, who Paul struck blind, okay, for getting on his nerves. Okay, so and I say getting on his nerves, I don't mean like it was a a personal annoyance to Paul, but he was getting in the way of the gospel. And so Paul struck him blind. Paul has power to punish people for the sake of the gospel. And he's choosing not to do that with the Corinthians. Instead of doing that, in fact, this is why after he took that second visit and it was sorrowful and they rejected him, instead of just unleashing the power of his ministry on them and striking them blind and maybe striking some of them dead, like Ananias and Sapphira were struck dead, he leaves and he writes that sorrowful letter, that bold letter. Now, in the letter, he was very bold and he talked a lot and probably threatened that when he comes a third time, he may have to drop the hammer on them. He may have to exercise his power. Okay, but up to this point, he has restrained from that. He's treated them with meekness and gentleness. Gentleness is strength under control. But because of that, because he has withheld his unleashing of his power and then written to them boldly, threatening them to do so, well, now they charge Paul with being inconsistent, with being a tough guy, right? With having courage from afar, because he writes all these mighty things in his letter, but then when he's in person with us, he has no boldness at all. He's very meek and he's very gentle. So this thing that Paul has done for their benefit, they've twisted against him. The false apostles have twisted against him and used it to accuse him of something. And Paul says in verse 2, I'm asking you that when I come to you a third time, and he's going to talk in this section, these 4 chapters, about this third visit that he's going to make. He's like, I'm asking you that when I do come to you, I don't have to be bold like I am in my letters. I don't have to unleash the power of my apostolic ministry and punish some of you. And you'll notice the word some used in these 4 chapters. Sometimes it'll say any of you, because remember back in chapter 2, the majority of the Corinthians seem to have repented, but some of them have not. And some of them are these false apostles. Some of them are still being influenced by these false apostles. And Paul's saying, please don't make me have to unleash my boldness as an apostle on you, because it's not going to go well for you. And he defines the some here as those who accuse him of walking according to the flesh, meaning they're accusing Paul of having fleshly human motives, like he's being sneaky and underhanded, he's trying to take advantage of them in some way, he's trying to trick them in some way. And Paul says, no, we do walk in the flesh. We are in these earthen vessels. We have fleshly weaknesses, absolutely, but we don't war according to the flesh. We don't do battle the way human beings typically do battle, to tear each other down with slander, like the false apostles are doing. They do war according to the flesh because they lie about their opponents and they are dishonest and they build straw men and paint false pictures of their opponents. Paul's not engaged in any of that stuff. What he is engaged in is spiritual warfare, and he's going after Satan, who has blinded the minds of the unbelieving, like he said back in chapter 4, and who has constructed strongholds in people's minds. And the picture here is of a military siege where an army surrounds a city with battering rams and tears down the walls of the city and brings down the towers, and then they can enter in and take people captive, and then anybody who resists, they can put them to death. That's what Paul is doing essentially as an apostle. He's tearing down Satan's fortresses in people's minds and hearts. And he's doing that not through worldly means, not through physical violence or slander or evil, but through argumentation and persuasion and through the truth of the gospel. And he's using godly weapons, probably including prayer, right, and divine wisdom and the power of the gospel message to do this work. And we're taking every thought captive to Jesus. We're bringing everybody out of Satan's bondage and into captivity to Jesus, which is actually where you want to be, because that's where you have eternal life. And Paul says, if there are people who are unwilling and who resist Paul's attempts to take them captive for Christ and to destroy Satan's strongholds in their minds, then he says, when I come to you, I will punish all disobedience. I will unleash my apostolic ministry, and it's not going to go well. He says, but we're ready to do that, but we want to do that when your obedience is complete. Verse 6. In other words, he wants he doesn't want to come and bring down punishment on the Corinthians unless all of the Corinthians are behind him and in support of him coming to punish the disobedient. He doesn't want to be resisted by the majority of the congregation when he comes to discipline people by his apostolic power. He wants the whole congregation to be on board and to realize, yeah, we got to deal with these people. We got to get these people out of here because they're setting up strongholds for Satan and they need to be destroyed. They need to be disciplined so that they can no longer have any influence in this congregation. Verse 7, you're looking at things outwardly. This has always been their problem. We saw this back in 1 Corinthians 2. They measure everything according to fleshly standards, looking through a human lens. And this is why they're opposed to Paul, because he doesn't look like an apostle. He suffers so much. He must not be a legitimate apostle. You know, he wasn't one of the original 12, so maybe they're calling that into question. They seem to even be calling into question whether Paul's a Christian or not, whether he's even a Christian. And Paul says, if any of you are Christians, well, then I'm a Christian, okay, because I'm the one that founded the church there. So if my Christianity is held in suspicion, then all of your Christianity is held in suspicion. Verse 8, if I boast somewhat further about our authority, which the Lord gave for building you up and not for destroying you, I will not be put to shame. Paul is setting up the idea that he is going to have to boast. He's going to have to engage in some boasting in this section about his apostolic power and his legitimacy as an apostle, because he's trying to defend himself here. But he's not going to be put to shame for that. Jesus is not ashamed of Paul for doing that. There's nothing wrong with it, and he doesn't want the Corinthians to put him to shame for it, or to look down on him and say, wow, look at him, he's boasting as an apostle, because he has every right to boast in his apostleship, because his apostleship is legitimate. Now, the false apostles, they absolutely will be put to shame, because their apostleship is not legitimate, and Paul's going to come and punish them, and they're going to be put to shame when Paul gets there. So Paul's boasting is not shameful, but the false apostles, their boasting absolutely is shameful. And here's just a good application as we close today, that when we are evangelizing, we are not to be engaging in human warfare where we're attacking the person and we're engaging in ad hominem and straw men. We're lying about what somebody believes so that we can just tear down this straw man that we've constructed that they don't even really believe. We're not slandering people. We're not raising our voices and yelling and shouting and trying to tear people down with our words. That's not how we engage in evangelism. What we're trying to do is we're trying to use logic. We're trying to use truth, the gospel, in a gentle and meek and humble way like Paul did, to try to persuade people so that the truth of the gospel will start to crumble that stronghold that Satan has set up in people's mind. That person is not our enemy. Satan is the enemy, and Satan is living within that person's mind and has set up this huge city in this person's mind, and we have to be patient and siege that city and take some time and start working around the edges and eventually start to find cracks and holes in that city until we can finally breach the wall and get in with the truth of the gospel and with the love of the gospel. And eventually they'll hopefully see that the gospel and the truth and what Jesus has to offer, Satan can't deal with it. It's so much more powerful than what Satan has. It makes so much more sense than Satan's world makes sense. And that wall and that city just comes crumbling down, and we're taking them captive for Jesus so that they'll obey Christ and have eternal life. Hope that's helpful. I'll see you tomorrow. Well, today we're in 2 Corinthians 10, verses 10 through 18, and we'll throw verse 9 in as well. Remember, yesterday I said that verse 9 probably goes better with verses 10 and 11 than it does connecting to verse 8. But as I studied it a little bit more, I'm realizing you can kind of see it both ways. But here's my problem, and this is really the difficulty with the letter of 2 Corinthians specifically, and that is that many times the Greek constructions that Paul uses in his sentences, his sentence structure is just a little bit difficult. And so verse 9 has kind of been making my head explode a little bit, because literally in the Greek it starts with in order that, or so that. But when you translate it that way, if you just take it very literally, very woodenly as so that or in order that, it doesn't really fit after verse 8 very well. Neither does it fit, though, before verses 10 and 11 very well. So the Greek translators who translated our Bibles into English, they realized, and they know much more about Greek than I do, they realized that you don't necessarily have to translate that so woodenly and so literally. And so you're going to have different versions. The New American Standard Version uses the word for, which is still a struggle for me. I still struggle with that word for because that's kind of similar to in order that or because of or something like that, and it just confuses me. The ESV, it just starts a brand new sentence in verse 9. It doesn't even try to connect it with verse 8. So just understand, this is a very difficult verse, and it has given commentators problems for a long time. It's not just me. That makes me feel better. It should make you feel better as well if you feel like this part is a little bit confusing. But the main point is absolutely clear in verse 9, that he's saying, when I write my letters to you, like that sorrowful letter that he wrote, probably he's also referencing 1 Corinthians as well, which was pretty harsh and pretty bold, calling out their sin. He's saying, when I do that, my goal is not to terrify you into obedience or to project this image of a terrifying person that is totally inconsistent with who I am when I'm with you face to face. And that's really an answer to the charge against him in verse 10. People are saying, yeah, his letters are really bold and he's super courageous and terrifying in his letters. But then when he's with us, well, he's very meek, he's very unimpressive, he's very humble and soft-spoken. And Paul's just answering the charge and saying, look, I'm not a different person in my letters than I am face to face. And I think there's a couple ways that you could take that, practically speaking. Number one, he's saying, look, if you read something that sounds really terrifying from me in my letters, because, I'm being very bold against sin and I'm calling you out, right? And I'm calling down judgment on you. Well, know that that's coming from the same person that loves you. I'm your spiritual father, the same person that was there in person with you, who's humble and meek and gentle. Know that all of my terrifying things I say in my letters, it's coming from a place of love. But then the other way to look at it is to say, don't read my terrifying things that I write in my letters and think that I won't actually follow through on my threats when I come to you in person. Don't think, oh, he's all talk. He says he's going to come drop the hammer on us and bring down his apostolic authority on and punish all the disobedient and all that. He says that in his letters, but he won't really do that because he's just a meek, gentle, humble person. And Paul's saying, no, if I'm saying something terrifying in my letters, it's going to be terrifying if I have to come to you in person and drop down the hammer and follow through on those terrifying things. So he's answering charges, but he's also trying to get them to take his letters seriously and to take him seriously as an apostle, whether in person or by letter. Now, I will also say, if you just take this meaning of verse 9, that I'm not trying to terrify you by my letters, that also means it could go with verse 8 as well. Because in verse 8, Paul says, look, I'm going to have to engage in boasting. And he's doing that because that is all that the Corinthians seem to be able to respond to, is boasting. But when Paul boasts, he's going to be boasting in the Lord. And so it's not going to be a shameful kind of boasting like the false apostles. All their boasting is shameful. And he's going to talk in today's reading about why their boasting is so shameful and why his boasting as an apostle is actually legitimate. But he's saying, look, when I do boast, I'm not going to be put to shame for that. Jesus isn't going to be ashamed of me. I don't have to be ashamed of my boasting because I'm not doing it just to terrify you or to put on some show or some front like the false apostles are. So that's a way that you could also connect verse 9 to verse 8. Little complex, but helpful, I think, sometimes to just walk through those things. Now, as he continues, he says, this is why their boasting is horrible, okay, but our boasting as an apostle is totally fine and honorable in the sight of the Lord. It's because in verse 12, when they boast, they use themselves as the standard for boasting. if you don't measure up to them, well, then you're no good. And in the first century world, these traveling philosophers and teachers, as they're trying to get followers, it was very common to engage in smear campaigns. And you would just criticize your opponents and tear them down. It's kind of like our modern day politics. When a new president's running for office, right, you're going to have the mudslinging campaigns going on, trying to tear the other person down. And what are they saying? Well, he's not like me. Right? If you really want a good candidate, right, to save the country, well, you need somebody like me to do it. They are the standard. And this is how these philosophers are. And they're criticizing Paul's appearance. They're criticizing Paul's ability to be an orator in an eloquent way. Okay? They're criticizing Paul for all of his suffering. He doesn't take any money, so maybe he's just not a professional. So they're just using all these worldly standards and ultimately themselves as the standard for boasting. And Paul says that's a shameful thing. He says when you do that, you're acting like fools. You are living without understanding. And he makes a little bit of a play on words in verse 12 when he says we are not bold. Because remember, they accused Paul of being bold in his letters, right? And Paul says, okay, well, we are bold, okay, but we're not so bold as to compare ourselves with ourselves and to use ourselves as the standard. That's just shameful and pointless. He says in verse 13, we will not boast beyond our measure, but within the measure of the sphere which God has apportioned to us as a measure to reach even as far as you. So Paul's saying, what I will boast in is the work that God has given me to do. The sphere of influence that God has given me as an apostle to go and preach the gospel, specifically to churches who had never heard it before. That's his main goal, is to bring the gospel to new ground, to places that had never heard the gospel and plant new churches. Paul says that will be the source of my boasting. But beyond that, I'm not going to boast in other things that I have no business boasting in. And the jab is that these false apostles are boasting in things that they have no right to boast in. So they're boasting that they're these great apostles and they're holding sway over the Corinthians, acting like they're so awesome. But they didn't establish the Corinthian church. They're essentially boasting in Paul's work. Paul's the one who planted that church. They have absolutely no right to boast in their own accomplishments with regard to the Corinthians, because they accomplished nothing in regard to the Corinthians. That was all God's work through Paul. And so he says in verse 14, we're not overextending ourselves as if we did not reach to you, for we were the first to come even as far as you in the gospel, not boasting beyond our measure, that is, in other men's labors. See that? They're boasting in other people's labors. They're boasting in labors. They're taking credit for things that Paul should take credit for. If they're saying, wow, we're in Corinth and we have this great following, and look at all these Christians who are just so great because of us and our work. And Paul's saying, what are you talking about? I'm the one that did that. Okay, so not only are they boasting in themselves and using their own accomplishments and their own standards as the standard by which to measure everything else by, they're also bragging in other people's labor, which is even more shameful. And so Paul's saying that his hope in verse 15 is that as the Corinthians' faith grows, that they will magnify Paul as an apostle, that his ministry will only be enlarged. And maybe another part of this is that once they start trusting in Paul as an apostle again, then he can sort of move on to other places. He doesn't have to keep putting out fires in Corinth over and over again. I mean, this has been a really long process, a really big distraction, kind of a thorn in the flesh for Paul, if you will. Now, he'll talk later about his thorn in the flesh. I don't think he's saying the Corinthians are the thorn in the flesh, but maybe that's part of it. I don't know. But Paul just wants to move on and continue preaching and leave the Corinthians alone so that they can flourish as a congregation. But he can't leave them alone. He has to keep on them and putting out all these spiritual fires caused by all these sins and all these false apostles. And Paul wants his ministry to be enlarged by them, magnified, so that they trust he's an apostle, he's absolutely from God. So now he can go on to other regions and continue to boast in what the Lord is doing through him. And he quotes from Jeremiah 9, don't let the rich man not boast in his riches, let not the mighty man boast in his might, let not the wise man boast in his wisdom, let him who boasts boast in this, that he understands and knows me. Paul's essentially saying, look, all of your worldly standards that you're using to boast about, they're pointless. What matters is what the Lord thinks of you, and that you can boast in Him, and that He can boast in you. You know, it's one thing, Paul says in verse 18, to commend yourself. But that doesn't matter whether you commend yourself. It matters whether the Lord commends you. And that is our lesson for today. That we have to be careful comparing ourselves with other people. Comparison, it always leads either to pride or to self-pity. And usually it's going to lead to pride, because if it's self-pity, we avoid comparing ourselves with people who are better than ourselves, because that leads to self-pity. We don't like doing that. So we'd rather just compare ourselves to the people that are worse off so that we can feel good about ourselves. And that is just foolishness. And it's a shameful thing. And we're not focusing on the Lord. We're putting ourselves up on the throne, on the pedestal, instead of putting God on the throne, and not realizing it really doesn't matter what our own opinion of ourselves is, how highly we think of ourselves. The only thing that matters is how highly God thinks of us. And we should also apply this in our evaluation of preachers as well. Sometimes we get into like, well, you know, who's more dynamic as a speaker, and who's more good looking, who's more sharp dressed, who has a better education and more, you know, degrees behind his name. And we start to get into all these earthly comparisons, worldly comparisons, and Paul's saying, stop that. We need to boast in what God is accomplishing through His messengers. Boast in the Lord and what He's doing in your life. Don't boast in yourself and what you're doing for yourself in your own life. That's just a horrible standard. It's not going to get you anywhere except condemned by the Lord in the end. Hope that's helpful. I'll see you tomorrow. Well, today we're in 2 Corinthians 11, verses 1 through 9, and there's a proverb, I think, that undergirds really this whole final section of this letter from chapter 10 to 13, and it's really a pair of proverbs. It's Proverbs 26, verses 4 and 5, and it's a very interesting pair because verse 4 says, "Do not answer a fool according to his folly, otherwise you might become like him." But then the very next verse says, "Answer a fool as his folly deserves, so that he not be wise in his own eyes." So verse 4 says, don't answer a fool according to his folly, but then verse 5 says, do answer a fool according to his folly. So how do you sort of put that together? Well, sometimes people are so hard-hearted and just so stubborn, and they have no interest really in the truth, that the only thing you can do is speak their language to get their attention, to sort of wake them up. If you try to just maintain your typical gospel presentation and tell them about Jesus, they're just going to keep trampling you underfoot. And so you have to change your approach sometimes with some people. Be a little bit harsher with them, not in a rude way, okay, but just to sort of wake them up. And I'll talk more about that at the end of today's video. But this is what Paul is doing with the Corinthians, because these false apostles are fools. They are hard-hearted. They have no interest in the truth of the gospel at all. And all they do is boast in themselves. And they boast in things that they have no business boasting in, like how well things are going there in Corinth with their followers, when Paul's saying in yesterday's reading, well, that was all my work, right? You didn't do any of that. So they're boasting in themselves as the standard. They're boasting in other people's labors. And so Paul is going to engage in boasting himself. He's going to answer the fool according to his own folly. Since boasting is the language that they speak so well, Paul too is going to boast. And the Corinthians seem to be responding well to the boasting of these false apostles, which makes them fools too. And so Paul's saying, okay, if that, Corinthians, is what you respond to so well, then I'm going to boast as well, so that you'll receive me the way that you're receiving these false apostles. But then you ask, okay, well, how does Paul do that then? How does he boast without becoming like them, without becoming a fool himself? Well, he does that based on the way that he boasts. He boasts, but he doesn't boast in himself as the standard. He boasts in the Lord. He boasts not in other people's labors, but he boasts in what the Lord has accomplished through him in his life. Things that are actually legitimate to boast about, because God is performing this work through him. He's not boasting in other people's labors like these false apostles. Now, in today's reading, we'll see his reason for boasting is different. The false apostles, when they boast, it's just to build themselves up. It's to get more followers so they can make more money. But Paul, he'll say, the reason I'm going to do this is so that I can win you back for Christ. I can keep you from being seduced by Satan and led astray from your husband in the Lord. So Paul's motivation for boasting is different as well. Now, as we continue on in this section, this final section of the letter, we'll see some other ways that Paul's boasting is distinguished and different from the boasting of the false apostles, that prevents him from becoming a fool like they are. Yet he still is able to answer them according to their folly, so that they not be wise in their own eyes. That Paul, as he boasts, he's exposing in a satirical way, in an ironic way, how foolish these people really are. Sometimes you don't understand how foolish something is until you hear somebody parroting it out loud. It's kind of like if a married couple goes to counseling and the counselor says, okay, I want you to role play, and the counselor asks the wife, okay, what does your husband sound like? And then the wife just starts, shouting these orders and calling names and using a demeaning tone. And the husband's just like, he's going to disagree and say, there's no way I sound like that. That's not what I do. Okay, but it's helpful sometimes. You don't know what you sound like until someone starts mimicking you and doing an impression of you. And so Paul, as he mimics and does an impression of these false apostles by boasting, he's showing how foolish, how silly it really is. But he's also staying on a higher moral plane than they are and not just totally stooping to their level by making sure that his boast is actually in things that are legitimate to boast about, like the Lord and the work that the Lord is doing in his life. Okay? And then later, his weaknesses, which is going to be another way that his boasting is different. He'll boast in his weaknesses. All right, so verse 1 then, he's asking, please bear with me in a little foolishness. Because he knows, I'm about to start boasting. This is really foolish. The New American Standard here is a little strange. It says, indeed you are bearing with me. Literally it means, do indeed bear with me. So some translations say, please bear with me. So Paul's he's begging them to understand that what he's about to do is very unnatural for him. Paul does not like to boast at all. That's not his character. It's not his personality. Okay, but he's doing this to counteract these false teachers, and he needs them to understand and to bear with him while he does this. And he tells them, here's my reason. And really, he presents himself as a father who has betrothed his daughter to a husband. And the betrothal period in Jewish culture was something that was more serious than our engagement. It was like engagement, saying, yes, I'm determined to marry this person. It happened a year before the marriage, but it was more serious than our engagement, because we can just break off an engagement and it's not as big a deal. I mean, it's painful emotionally, obviously, but from a legal perspective, you can break an engagement. It's not a big deal. But in Jewish culture, if you cheated during the betrothal period, well, that was considered adultery. And even though you were betrothed, you were actually considered husband and wife. So it was a very serious thing for you to cheat on your husband or cheat on your wife while you were betrothed to them. Now, the marriage hadn't taken place yet. And when the marriage takes place, that's when you actually move in together and start living together as a family. Okay, but the betrothal period is very important to stay pure and to stay devoted. Well, Paul's saying, look, I betrothed you to Jesus. The marriage ceremony hasn't happened yet. That will happen on the day of judgment when we finally are reunited with him and we go to live with him and move in with him forever in heaven. Okay, but until that point, we're betrothed. We're saying he is our husband. We are his wife. And so if they're cheating on Jesus with these false apostles who actually are introducing a totally different Jesus, a totally different spirit, they're committing adultery against Jesus. It's very serious. And it actually makes Paul look bad too. I mean, if a father betroths his daughter to a husband and the daughter cheats on the husband that she's betrothed to, that reflects poorly on the father. And so Paul, he's jealous for them. He wants them to be devoted solely to Jesus. He is their husband. They need to be faithful to him. And this is why he's going to boast, so that he can wake them up and get them to be faithful to Jesus again. He says, I'm afraid that the serpent, right? Satan is actually working on you. Just like he deceived Eve in the garden, he's deceiving you. They're teaching you, a different Jesus that we've not preached. Okay, these false apostles, they obviously have no idea who Jesus is because of the way that they boast and the way that they're out for money and the way that they're slandering and telling lies against Paul. I mean, they're not serving the true Jesus at all. Earlier, Paul mentioned hints that maybe they're still thinking they need to keep the law of Moses, right? They're going to serve Jesus, but this Jesus wants us to keep the old covenant. Totally different Jesus, totally different spirit. Okay, the spirit is the kind of character and heart that we develop, and the spirit also is seen to come from the spiritual realm. Okay, so it's either the Holy Spirit from God, or it's a different kind of spirit from the demonic spirits that teach us a different kind of character and heart. And yeah, the false apostles, they have a totally different character and heart and spirit than the Holy Spirit from Jesus. Verse 5, I consider myself not in the least inferior to the most eminent apostles. The literal translation is the super apostles. And I think he's sarcastically referring to these false apostles as super apostles because they make themselves out to be so great. And he says, I'm not inferior to them. I might be inferior in speech. They might be better orators than me, but they don't have the knowledge that I do. They don't know the real Jesus. They don't know the true gospel like I do. And now he gets into this idea of committing a sin in not taking money from them. Remember back in 1 Corinthians 9, Paul says, I have every right to take money from you as a preacher, but he refused to use his right because he didn't want to look like these traveling philosophers who were just in it for the money. Also, there was this patronage system where if Paul were to take money from wealthy Corinthians, then it would be like they became his sponsors. And if you have a sponsor, even today, like in sports, if you have Nike sponsoring you, Nike has certain expectations on you for the way that you act and the way that you speak. And you have to toe their line, and there's sort of pressure to conform with what Nike wants you to do because they're paying you. Well, Paul knew if he puts himself in this patronage situation with the Corinthians, they're going to be pulling the strings on Paul. They're going to want Paul to, dance to the beat of their drum, if you will. And Paul's like, no, I'm not going to obligate myself to you and put these social expectations on myself just because you're paying me money. Well, they took that as an insult. And even today, it can be insulting if you try to give a gift to someone and they don't want it. Okay, so they're insulted because they, wanted to put Paul probably under this patronage situation. And Paul's not having it. And he says, I'm going to continue to not take money from you. He references in verse 9 all the way back to Acts 18, where he came to them for the first time about 5 years ago at this point, 5 or 6 years ago at this point. 2 Corinthians written around 55, 56 AD. He comes to Corinth originally in 50 or 51 AD. So again, 5 or 6 years ago, he says, when I came to you, I wasn't a burden to you. I was a tent maker. But it wasn't until Silas and Timothy came in Acts 18 and verse 5, they came down from Macedonia bringing money from them that I could then go and preach the gospel to you. Now, it is interesting in verse 8, he says, I robbed other churches. Maybe he's using that for a couple reasons. One, he's saying I robbed them in the sense that I took money from them, but I'm not actually preaching for them. So it's kind of like robbery in that sense. They're paying me, but they're not really getting anything in return because I'm not there with them preaching. Maybe that's part of it. It could also be a response to the false accusations of these super apostles who said, Paul, he boasts about not taking money from you, but then he wants you to take up this big collection. And really, he's just coming to rob you. And when he comes in to get that collection, it's a way for him to sneakily take money from you without submitting to the patronage system, without becoming a client of yours. And so Paul just sort of tongue-in-cheek saying, yeah, I'm a robber, and I robbed other churches instead of robbing you. So what's the big deal? How is that a sin? And later in tomorrow's reading, he'll say, do you think I don't love you, because I did that? So they're really having a problem. They're really struggling here and accusing Paul of false motives for not taking money from them. So here's the application. I had an atheist that I was talking to recently on our YouTube channel, and I was trying so hard to get him to just have a normal conversation with me, a back and forth, but all he did was insult me, call me a liar. He'd say, what are you, an idiot? I mean, it was just, he had no interest in a real conversation. He would use sarcasm all the time. So eventually, after a few attempts to treat him with love and dignity and respect and all that, I said, okay, I need to change my approach. Since he's all about sarcasm, that's what I'll use on him. And so I started to say, after he'd insult me, I'd say, wow, that's a really strong argument. Man, your logic is just rock solid there, almost convinced me. And you could tell it really kind of got under his skin, okay? But I was doing it because I'm trying to wake him up to show him how foolish he is. Jesus says, do not cast your pearls before swine. Some people are just spiritual swine who have no interest in truth. And when you give them the gospel, they'll just trample it underfoot, okay? Like a pig who's angry that you didn't give him what he wanted, okay? And you gave him these beautiful pearls, and the pig doesn't appreciate pearls, and so they just stomp on them. So sometimes, in order to reach the pig, you have to give them what they respond to. And so I was hitting him with sarcasm so that he would see the folly of his own ways. Number one, to show him I'm acting just like he is. So if he gets mad at me for acting that way, well, he needs to get mad at himself because that's how he was acting. Okay, but also, it's just a way to shut him down and show him how foolish he is and that his wisdom cannot stand against the wisdom of God. I know it's hard to use that without stooping to people's level. Okay, we have to be careful how we use that. But sometimes that's just how we have to do it. If a person is just a really direct and just abrasive person, sometimes we have to be direct and abrasive with them in our evangelistic approach because it's the only language that they speak. It's the only thing they understand. So everything is tailored to each person. Hard to know how to apply that in every situation, but I hope that principle is helpful from Proverbs 26, verses 4 and 5. I'll see you tomorrow. Well, today we're in 2 Corinthians 11, verses 10 through 20. And remember, Paul is going to be boasting, even though he doesn't really want to boast because it's something foolish, but he's doing it to reach the Corinthians. And he's already boasted a little bit earlier in yesterday's reading when he said, look, I'm not inferior to these other apostles. They may be better speakers than me, but I have more knowledge than they do. So Paul is boasting not in his rhetorical ability, but in the content that he preaches. And then he also boasts that he didn't take money from them. Now that's kind of an interesting difference there. These false apostles would be boasting about how much money they could make off of their followers. But Paul actually is boasting that he doesn't charge the Corinthians. And that actually caused problems in their relationship, and the Corinthians weren't happy that Paul did not charge them. Paul didn't do that specifically there in Corinth. Even though he took money from other churches, he didn't take it from the Corinthians because he knew this problem of traveling philosophers, people coming through being teachers for money, was a huge problem. He didn't want to be lumped in with them. He also didn't want to submit himself to that patron-client relationship where he would be beholden to the beneficiaries. Those that give Paul money would essentially want Paul to praise them and preach and teach the things that they want him to preach and teach. And Paul he wanted to be able to stay neutral, okay, in his preaching, where he didn't feel like he was beholden to say what his donors wanted him to say. Now, I'm bringing that up again because I find it interesting. In yesterday's reading, he said, I did it to keep myself from being a burden to you. He mentioned that a couple times in yesterday's reading, and that's a little weird because the Corinthians were relatively wealthy, so it wouldn't really be a financial burden for Paul to be paid by them. Plus, he took money from Macedonian churches, which were poorer than the Corinthians, so it seems weird that he would be willing to burden them financially, but not burden the Corinthians. So I think probably part of the burden he's talking about is the emotional burden that they would bear if they paid Paul money and then Paul had to correct them for their sin. Because that would be very painful in and of itself to be corrected and to be rebuked by an apostle, but it'd be even more painful if you're paying this guy money, right? Because you would expect in that patron-client relationship, if I'm the patron who's paying my client money, well, my client, he's just going to say good things about me. But when Paul comes back and he's rebuking them for their sin and he's writing them this really hard letter of 1 Corinthians and then later the sorrowful letter and then even rebuking them here in 2 Corinthians, it would be much more of a burden to them, feeling like, wow, he's taking our money and he's sort of railing against us. That would be even more painful, even more of a burden. And Paul's just saying, look, I just wanted to avoid all of that. And he's going to continue to not take money from them, and he's going to continue making that his boast. Again, he's boasting like the foolish false apostles, but his boasting is of a different quality. He's boasting in the Lord. He's boasting in righteous things. And the righteous thing that he did for them is not take money from them, even though it insulted them in some way. And maybe they felt like Paul doesn't love us. I mean, he favors these other Christians in different churches. He likes other people better than he likes us. And Paul's saying, no, everything that I did for you was because I love you. In verse 12, he says, I'm going to continue not taking money from you so that I will differentiate myself from these false apostles. The false apostles, they claim to be legitimate apostles like Paul. They're probably comparing themselves and saying, look, we're just like Paul. We're just as legitimate as he is. But Paul's saying, look, I'm going to show them their illegitimacy by doing something they would never be willing to do themselves, which is not take money for their work. There's no way they would do that. They would not preach for free. But Paul would. And Paul's doing that to show he's not like them at all, and they cannot compare themselves to him and say that they're like him at all. He's a true apostle who's not just in it for selfish financial gain. He's in it for Jesus and is willing to make gospel sacrifices, even monetarily, in order to promote the gospel. And these false apostles, they're not willing to do that. And so Paul realizes, if I take money, well, then I'm going to look just like the false apostles, and I'm going to give the false apostles justification. And they're going to say, well, look, Paul took money from you, so we can take money from you. And Paul's saying, no, I don't want any association with them at all, because they're false apostles. They're deceiving you. They're actually workers of Satan. And he says, no wonder, because even Satan disguises himself as an angel of light. This comes probably from a Jewish tradition. Several different Jewish writings talk about how Satan, when he appeared to Eve in the garden, he appeared as an angel, a very bright, shining angel. And Paul's saying, look, these people, they might be passing themselves off as righteous people. And even if they were angels, it doesn't mean they're not from Satan. You have to be so on guard, because Satan is always trying to find inroads into the church. He's always trying to deceive Christians and destroy God's church from the inside. And he says, if Satan disguises himself as an angel, it's no wonder that his servants, these false apostles, would also disguise themselves. Remember, Jesus said a servant is not above his master, and that the servant will be like his master. So if Satan is their master and he's disguising himself, well, then of course these false apostles as his servants will also be disguising themselves as servants of righteousness. But their end will be according to their deeds. They're going to face judgment for this. It's all going to be exposed in the end. Verse 16, remember, he's trying to answer their folly with folly. But he doesn't want them to think that he's actually becoming like them. And so he says, please, I'm boasting. And he's really, starting in verse 22, about to engage in the heaviest boasting. Really from verse 22 of chapter 11 all the way through chapter 12 and verse 13. He's really going to be boasting in fleshly things, in accomplishments, things that have happened to him, his experiences that make it sound like he's saying, look how great I am because I have all these accomplishments. Okay, but he wants them to know when he's doing this, he's not actually being a fool. He's just playing the fool. He's just acting here. He's playing a role to show what these false apostles sound like and to try to reach the Corinthians who are accepting these false apostles. So he says, don't think that I actually am foolish, but if you do think I'm a fool, well, then receive me anyway. What I'm saying, verse 17, this is not really coming from Jesus. This isn't something Jesus would do. Jesus would not engage in boasting. I'm being foolish on purpose here. And he says, since these false apostles are boasting so much in their fleshly accomplishments, well, then that's what I'm going to do as well, so that you'll accept me. Why? Because you are accepting them. You, in your wisdom, he's being sarcastic here in verse 19, you're so wise. You think that you're so wise, Corinthians, and they had this problem back in 1 Corinthians as well, They continue to think that they're so wise in this world, and yet they tolerate these fools. And so Paul's saying, I want you to tolerate me then. Accept me. Okay, because I'm the true apostle. And if it requires me to boast and to act like a fool in order for you to accept me as legitimate, then so be it. That's what I'm going to do. In verse 20, you tolerate it. If anyone enslaves you, anyone devours you, takes advantage of you, exalts himself, anyone hits you in the face. It seems like these false apostles can, if you think about it this way, false teachers can go one of two ways. One, a false teacher can just sort of tell you everything that you want to hear, and they just sort of tickle your ears and everything's really pleasant. Okay, but false teachers can also be, on the other end of the spectrum, very militant, very strong-willed, very forceful and bold in their presentation, maybe even a little belittling to people. And ironically, that can also attract followers. And that seems to be what these false apostles are doing. They are projecting this sort of just worldly strength and assertiveness and dominance in their presentation and their teaching, which is why, by the way, they probably used Paul's weakness as a source of attack. And they said, oh, he's bold in his letters, yes, but he's not bold like we are, because we're bold in person. And Paul's not bold in person like we are. But Paul's saying, actually, these people are just abusing you. I mean, I don't think he's being literal when he says they hit you in the face. I think it's just, they're just taking advantage and wronging the Corinthians, and yet they're tolerating them. How absurd that they would tolerate these false apostles who are being abusive and dominant, but they wouldn't accept Paul, who's just been meek and gentle and loving with them the whole time. It's really absurd. Our application for today is to go back to that verse in verse 14. Satan disguises himself as an angel of light. We have to be on guard constantly and realize Satan is constantly trying to infiltrate the church through people who maybe look righteous on the surface, but in their hearts, they are not like Jesus. They believe in a different Jesus. They live by a different spirit, and they can totally corrupt the church. In fact, entire denominations and religions have been started by founders who thought that an angel of God appeared to them. Islam started from Muhammad in the year 610, who believed that the angel Gabriel appeared to him in a cave and revealed the word of God to him. The Mormons, they were started by an angelic, supposed angelic revelation. Seventh-day Adventists, they weren't founded by an angelic revelation, but their prophet Ellen G. White talks about different visions of angels and run-ins with angels. Okay, angels all throughout history have been a problem in God's church, at least people thinking that they were legitimate angels when they really weren't. They're just Satan in disguise. Paul later in Galatians chapter 1, he'll say, even if we or an angel from heaven preach to you a different gospel than what we preach to you, let him be accursed. So the ultimate way to tell if we're being deceived or not is to come back to the apostolic teaching. It doesn't matter who's teaching you. If he looks like he has it all together and he's dazzling and diamond studded and attractive and he's just shining like a bright angel, or even if you think you had a legitimate vision from an angel and the angel in a vision tells you something different, you need to always compare it to what God has already revealed in His Word through the true, inspired, legitimate apostles like Paul and the others. I hope that's helpful. That'll keep us strong in the church. I'll see you tomorrow. Well, now we're in 2 Corinthians 11, verses 21 to 33, and here Paul gets into the heart of his boasting, where he really starts to act like these false apostles, though again, his boasting is different. He's going to boast in his weaknesses, something that the false apostles would not do. And in verse 21, it really connects back to yesterday's reading to verse 20, because the false apostles were criticizing Paul for not being strong like they are. But what does strength mean to them? Well, strength to them means that you are enslaving people, devouring people, taking advantage of people. And Paul says, yeah, by comparison, I'm not strong like the false apostles are. And he's being ironic here. To my shame, I've been weak by comparison. Forgive me that I haven't been strong like they are, Corinthians, and taken advantage of you and abused you like they have. And it's ironic because, again, some of the Corinthians are rejecting Paul, and Paul's saying, but you're rejecting me for not acting like an abuser? Like you're rejecting me for being not strong in the sense of taking advantage of you? Like that's a weird definition of strength. And so Paul's being sarcastic here, just again trying to expose the folly of the Corinthians for following these false apostles who consider themselves super apostles. And Paul now is about to list his own accomplishments the way they do, but it's going to be a little bit different. And so he sets it up still at the end of verse 21. He still wants them to know, okay, I am bold, okay? If you're bold about things, well, I can be bold too. I can boast in my own accomplishments, but then in parentheses he puts, I speak in foolishness. So he still wants them to know, I'm not actually a fool like they are. I'm just playing their game. I'm just showing you what it looks like when someone boasts. And so he starts with his Jewish pedigree. They think they're so great because they're Hebrews. Paul says, I'm a Hebrew too. They think they're so great that they're Israelites. So am I. Descendants of Abraham, so am I. Maybe the difference there is that Hebrews refers to their ethnicity. And so they just think they're superior because they're of a better race. Israelites may refer to their religion, right? That they were born as the nation of Israel to serve the one true God. And then descendants of Abraham may speak to the fact that they are the inheritors of the promises to Abraham. And Paul's saying, I am all those things too. I can put those exact same things on my resume. In fact, later in a letter that he'll write in Philippians, he'll say he is a Hebrew of Hebrews. He has one of the greatest Jewish pedigrees that there is. So by comparison, I mean, these guys don't even compare to Paul in terms of their Jewish heritage. But now he's going to get in verse 23 to his weaknesses. He's going to boast in his sufferings and the pains that he's gone through. And this is not something that the false apostles could boast in. And again, he says, I speak as if insane. So here he moves beyond just this is foolishness to this is madness. That I shouldn't even be talking like this. This is just insanity for a Christian to be boasting about his own accomplishments. So again, he doesn't really want to do this, but he's going to. And again, it's of a higher quality. So he says, look, I've worked way harder than they have. I've been put in prison. Okay, I've been beaten times without number, in danger of death. And he just, he lists all these horrible things that he's been through. And what's fascinating about this is in our chronology, keep in mind, we are only in Acts 20 in verse 2. Okay, so everything that Paul lists here happened between Acts 9 and Acts 19. And that means there's a lot of these things that he lists that the book of Acts doesn't tell us, that Luke just doesn't give us details about. We do learn in Acts about him being beaten with rods. That happened when he was in Philippi. He and Silas, were beaten with rods. But many of these things, even shipwrecks and stuff, we won't learn about a shipwreck until Acts 27, the very end of Acts. That hasn't even happened to Paul yet. That's going to be another shipwreck that he can add to his resume. And I just find this fascinating, this thought, that maybe you can sympathize a little bit more with John Mark. Remember John Mark? He goes on Paul's first missionary journey and then he turns back and he abandons them. Well, maybe that's because he had a bunch of shipwrecks and, he got jumped by robbers and stuff. And Luke didn't really tell us that in the text, but it's just implied that the journey was so treacherous and so dangerous that John Mark turned back and he didn't want to go with them. And who could blame him for that if he's going through these types of things on that journey? But apart from all of the physical suffering that he went through the emotional suffering of just daily concern for the church and Satan's attacks on the church from the outside by persecution and from the inside by immorality, like was happening here in Corinth. And of course, the Corinthians were one of his main concerns, one of the main churches that was constantly on his heart. And he's had all these interactions with them in this big, relationship conflict with them that's just been weighing on him. And he says in verse 29, who is weak without my being weak? It's like if anybody is struggling in their Christianity in any way, Paul internalizes that, and it's like he's struggling. It's like their problems are his problems. He wears their well-being on his shoulders so much that he just feels the weight of how all the Christians around him are doing. He's led into intense concern. If somebody's in sin, it's just an intense level of concern and care and a desire to want to help them and to do whatever he can to snatch them out of the fires of sin. That's just constantly weighing on Saul. And that's because that's his character. He's so different from these false apostles who abuse Christians, right, and who take advantage of Christians. Whereas Paul, he's over here concerned that Christians are being abused and that Christians are being taken advantage of and that these false apostles are wreaking havoc in the church in Corinth. That's been weighing on Paul's heart, and he's intensely concerned about it. So again, you can see that this boasting is totally different from the boasting of the false apostles. They're so interested in their earthly success, in their earthly worldly stature and status in society and all that, and the things that Paul's boasting in would not be viewed as successes at all. I mean, these are beatings and suffering and being rejected by the world. That's his boast. And he actually says in verse 30, I boast in my weaknesses. And that's the thing, Paul doesn't really boast. He's not really into boasting, but if he is going to boast, he's going to boast in his weaknesses because at least that takes the focus off of himself. And it puts it on God and God's power working in him and through him, that even despite all of this suffering, he can actually accomplish great things in the kingdom because God is working through him. So again, this just shows that Paul is nothing. His boasting is not in himself. Ultimately, his boasting is in the Lord. In fact, he mentions Acts chapter 9, where he escapes out the window from Damascus. Now, we'll talk more in Galatians when we get there, that he went to Arabia briefly after his conversion, and he made some people mad, presumably, in Arabia. And so the king of Arabia sends for him in Damascus and tries to bring him back to Arabia, and he escapes out the window. Now, that was significant because many times people would lower their trash out the window. So Paul, he's kind of compared to trash there as he gets lowered out. And not only that, but the Romans, the Roman emperor would give an award called a mural crown to the first Roman soldier in a siege to scale the wall of the enemy. If a Roman soldier had the courage to go and be the first one to scale the wall of a besieged city, well, then he would get a crown called a mural crown, and the crown actually would look like a wall. Basically, I'll put a picture up so you can see it. But that would be a sign of honor and courage and bravery and heroism and all that. But Paul, rather than going up a wall of a city, well, he's being lowered down a city wall, running for his life. Okay, so it's the opposite of honor. It's a shame. It's a dishonor. It looks like he doesn't have any courage. And this is how his ministry started. This was like one of the very first things that happened to him as he began his ministry, and it became sort of the standard for how things would continue to go throughout the rest of his ministry. So again, this is not about Paul at all. This is about God. In fact, if you remember, there were some stories in the Old Testament of people being lowered out the window, like the two spies in Joshua chapter 2. The two spies went in to spy out the city of Jericho, and Rahab lowered them out the window from their enemies. But what happened after that? Ultimately, their shame and fleeing, being let out the window, led to victory over the city of Jericho. Later, David is lowered out the window, escaping from Saul, but he becomes king. Why? Because of the power of God working in those situations. And the same thing is true with Paul. He may have been lowered out the window disgracefully, but God uses Saul's weakness to accomplish great things in his kingdom, because that is where the power comes from. Remember, this whole book is about Paul defending his apostleship with the principle of power in weakness. And the weaker Paul is, to the world, the more powerful he is to God, because God is working in him, the more useful he becomes in the kingdom, because he's trusting in God's strength, not his own. He's trusting in God's accomplishments, not his own. And as far as application goes, this is very difficult because we don't really want to boast as Christians. I mean, even boasting in what God has done through us can come across as arrogant. You go around telling people like, yeah, God's just been so great. He's been using me to feed tons of poor people. He's just so great. It's like, that sounds like a veiled boast in yourself. So I wouldn't recommend doing that. But I do think there's a lesson here about what we should be, at least internally, proud of. Our world is proud of all the wrong things. They're proud of their body count. That's actually a slang term for the number of sexual partners you've had. Instead, let's be proud that we've been faithful in our marriage, that we've been married for decades, and we're doing things God's way, and we're raising godly children. Okay? If the world is proud of how big their bank account is, maybe we've been struggling financially, but we can be proud and take pride in the fact that God is teaching us contentment in this season of our lives. And he's drawing us closer. If the world is proud that they have great health and everything's going well for them, but we have health problems, we can be proud that God uses our weakness as a source of comfort to others, that we can empathize with others and what they're going through. And the world is proud of their popularity, but we can be proud that maybe we're not so popular because of our moral stand for what's right and what's good and what's true. What Paul is proud of here is really that he's like Jesus, that he's suffering for the sake of righteousness just like Jesus did, so that God can use him like he used Jesus to accomplish his purposes. Let's be proud of the things that God is proud of, and don't look down on ourselves as failures, or that God is angry at us or something just because we don't look like the rest of the world. We're not supposed to look like the rest of the world. We shouldn't be able to boast in the same things that the world boasts in. We should have a totally different standard. That's God's standard. Have a great weekend. I'll see you on Monday.